Thanks everyone for calling in. So today I'll be presenting hyperspectral mineralogy and exploration more than white mica and chlorite. A bit of a cheeky title, but I think that it's important to kind of get across the breadth of what can be done with hyperspectral mineralogy because things have come a long way in the last 10 years. So I'm going to try and give a quick overview of that. So before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional owners of the land that I'm presenting on today, which is coming to you from Wallyup or Fremantle, Western Australia. And I'd like to extend that respect to the traditional owners of the lands that you are watching from today, and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging, and to their ongoing connection to land and country, and the importance of that to their culture. And so I'd also like to acknowledge my colleagues in the CMR Discovery Program. We're a cohort of about 90 geoscientists, mathematicians, geophysicists, statisticians, software engineers who work across the kind of exploration sphere, trying to deliver impact to the mineral exploration space. And so just an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to start with a bit of an intro to hyperspectral mineralogy, because that might be new to some folks. Talk about where we're at, what kind of outputs can we generate from this technique, what sort of instrumentation is available, what new advances have happened in instrumentation, and then I'm going to show a couple applications of hyperspectral mineralogy beyond white mica and chlorite. So applications for rare earth exploration, lithium, skarn, carbonite discrimination, some IOCG, how you can use it to assist with logging or modeling other parameters. So a bit of a whirlwind tour, but I thought it would be good to show a range of different examples from different commodities and exploration contexts. And then I'll do a bit of a summary. And so, intro to hyperspectral mineralogy. So you may ask first, why do we want to collect mineralogy? Well, we mine minerals, but we don't really collect mineralogy. Why is that? I think part of it is not part of the standard workflow. The only point in the minerals value chain where we collect abundant mineralogical data is maybe during the geometallurgical side of things. But I think there's implications in the exploration stage or reasons we should be collecting mineralogy data, but we haven't always had to do that. Part of that is because in the past we've maybe had shallower deposits or simpler ores. We really haven't had to have that extra information in order to explore. Geochemical proxies have often been enough, or extrapolating mineralogy based on geochemistry has been enough to vector towards ore deposits. And traditional methods for mineralogical analysis are quite expensive. Things like SEM-based or XRD, they're time-consuming and expensive. And newer, cheaper, faster methods always take time to be socialized. PXRF, we saw the same thing. It took time for that to get picked up. And I think hyperspectral mineralogy is on that same, I guess, path, where it's people kind of accepted it's really good for white mica and chlorite, but there's a lot more that can be done. So I think that we at first hit this kind of peak of inflated expectations, and now we're coming back into this slope of enlightenment when we're realizing that there's a lot more that can be done. And I think that we're approaching the plateau of productivity in this kind of expectations plot. And so I hope to convey that to you, that that's where we're going. So what can you get from hyperspectral mineralogy? You can get insights into presence and absence of mineral species, mineral composition, whether you have magnesium-rich or iron-rich chlorite, relative mineral abundance. Those can all be used to look at alteration, halos, alteration vectoring, or assemblages, lithological classification, crystallinity, water content and bonding, grain size and orientation. And so the most common applications are in looking at white mica and chlorite. And so you've probably seen something similar to this, where you've got your spectra and you've extracted information about those mineral species to create a map or a plot or a downhole plot to give a classification based on that. If you've been quite a little more adventurous, you might have also looked at carbonate, which is quite commonly used in the shortwave infrared. And so this is just an example from a recent paper by a colleague of mine where they've classified the Abra lead zinc silver deposit using these mineral classifications. And so that sounds great. There's a lot you can figure out. So where are the opportunities and challenges? So in addition to having being able to get all that information, hyperspectral mineralogy is also spatially comprehensive. It's scalable. It's non-contact, non-destructive. There's little to no sample prep required. It's physics-based, which I'll show you in the theory next. So it's traceable, measurable, reproducible, and objective. And with respect to other methods, it's fast and cheap. There are some challenges, of course. It is truly a surface technique where you're measuring just the top kind of a couple hundred microns maybe of the target surface. It's inherently qualitative and requires validation for mineral quantification. And the thing is that for most applications, qualitative spectral mineral outputs are enough. If you're looking at vectoring towards an ore deposit, you want to see changes, relative changes in abundance or chemistry of mineral species. I don't think anyone is that concerned whether you're going from 26% to 24% to 23%, 18% white mica. You're looking for that change over space and time. And so for many applications, qualitative outputs are enough. But if you do need quantitative outputs, it can be calibrated and validated using other methods, things like QXRD or ChemScan. And there's also a really fast rate of advancement in looking at data integration and predicting different rock properties from hyperspectral data. So you can get your general hyperspectral data outputs, which I'll talk about later, but you can also use this faster, cheap method to predict other rock properties, which may be important for exploration. And so in its very simplest form, this is how hyperspectral mineralogy works. You've got your sample target, whether that's a piece of drill core, an outcrop, or a small hand sample. You've got your instrument, which has a light source. Your radiation interacts with your sample. If this is your spectrum of wavelength versus intensity of your radiation, it may be flat like that. When it interacts with the sample, some energy is absorbed, some is reflected, and the wavelengths which are absorbed and reflected are directly related to the composition of your sample. And so your detector records a spectrum of wavelength versus intensity. And in the VNIR SWIR, where you get these dips in your spectrum, that's where that wavelength of energy has been absorbed by your sample. And that is related directly to the chemistry of your sample. And in the thermal infrared, you get the same thing, but you'll see these troughs, peaks. And so you're basically looking at how the light changes after interacting with your sample. And so there's several different geologically relevant spectral regions. The visible near infrared is from 400 to 1000 nanometers. And this is where those interactions that are happening between your radiation and your sample are related to electronic modes in your sample. So in the case of iron, these are crystal field transitions of the electrons. So this part of the spectrum is really sensitive to iron oxides, transition metals, rare earth elements. So in this slide, I have highlighted the examples I'll be talking about in red, and then the things that people often forget or don't realize can be used in these wavelength ranges, I've highlighted those as in bold. So VNIR, you can look at iron oxides, transition metals like copper, moly, nickel, as well as rare earths. In the short wave infrared, which is what most folks are familiar with, 1000 to 2500 nanometers, this is where you're seeing overtones and combinations of vibrational modes. So I mentioned when you get absorption of your radiation by your sample, that may be because it's absorbed by the energy of a specific bond. And that's your fundamental vibrational mode. And then shorter in the spectrum, you get these overtones and vibrations. And so the SWIR is super sensitive to things like chlorites and white micas, which is why they're so well known. But also other mineral phases like clays and amphiboles and sulfates and carbonates. The midwave infrared sits just above that. It's less well understood. This is where some of those fundamental vibrational modes sit, and it's basically sensitive to all rock-forming minerals apart from sulfides. The thermal infrared or long wave infrared is slightly longer wavelength from about 6,000 to 1,400 nanometers, and this is all, again, vibrational modes, and it's sensitive to silicate minerals, things like quartz, feldspars, garnets, pyroxenes, carbonates, phosphates, etc. So for those of you that are a little more visually inclined, here's the same thing in the visual format. So in the shortest wavelength, VNIR, you're really sensitive to iron oxides, rare earths, transition metals. The kind of SWIR region, really sensitive to hydrosilicates like clays, carbonates, sulfates, and then the thermal carbonates, sulfates, phosphates, the hydrosilicates. All right, so not only do you have this large spectral range at which you can detect nearly every mineral species, there's also a huge range of scales at which you can detect these. So hyperspectral mineralogy can be used from kind of the satellite scale, things like Aster, or even the satellites that we have orbiting Mars telling us about the Martian surface composition, down to the micron scale with lab-based techniques. And so you've got this entire range of scales, which if you think about it from an exploration context is, all the way from your regional targeting down to ore body characterization. And if you want a review of this, my colleague, Karsten, Ian, and Monica put out a good paper kind of highlighting this stuff. And so you've got this range of scales in terms of measurement capability, but also different wavelength regions. And instrumentation that we're at right now, that we have available right now, encompasses basically all of that. From kind of in the VNR SWIR, you can see that's where most instruments lie, and that's because that's been kind of the most used spectral range. It's really good for mineralogy, but what it was originally developed for was not for geoscience applications. And so you've got things from drill core scale to conveyor belt and airborne and spaceborne. Then you go to thermal infrared. You've got some core imaging systems and airborne, and then you can see the midway infrared. There's really only kind of two systems that currently work in that space. And so where are we at? So I'm going to talk about what are the most common spectral mineralogy outputs first. So probably the most common output you'll see from hyperspectral mineralogy data is what folks will call spectral mineralogy or spectral contribution. And this is basically what minerals, usually it's a mineral and then an abundance of that mineral. And that's done by several different methods. And so probably the most commonly used, or I guess the one of the longest history, is using linear unmixing of spectral, using external spectral library. So basically you have your spectra that you've collected, you have a library of known spectra, and then you kind of do a matching where you try and mix the known spectra to create your unknown. This involves quite a lot of expert knowledge, usually a custom library, and there's several ways to do it. So TSG software does that, so you may have seen something like this before, which is a high logger data set where you have kind of mineral abundance on the X and depth on the Y, and then you've, or on the Y and then on the X, and then you've got your thermal infrared outputs here, which you can see are dominated by the pink, which is quartz, and then in the short infrared outputs dominated by chlorite in the green. And you can see this change in a kind of general mineral abundance downhole. There's complexities associated with this. There's overlaps. Spectra, there's a lot of non-unique spectra because those fundamental vibrational modes you're probing are related to specific bonds or mineral structures. There are minerals that are quite structurally similar, and so you will have features that are in the same area. And not all mixtures act as linear mixtures, so it can be complex. There's also several commercial offerings that do the same thing and produce the same sorts of outputs. And an example is the CSIRO platform, and this uses an AI model with over 2 million VNIR SWIR spectra to generate basically the same thing. So here's an example of showing white mica. They call it spectral contribution versus depth downhole colored by gold. And so you can see changes in white mica abundance, basically, which is what you're saying here in the change in the yellow, which is white mica, but those are different drill holes. There's also different service providers that generate these data sets. So CSIRO, you generate your own data set and send it to them, they process it for you. There's service providers like Geological and TerraCore who do something similar using a mineral assemblage approach to generate the same outputs. The other way to do it is to get quantitative results. You can collect validation data, do some sort of calibration. An example would be using PLS modeling, which you can do, for instance, in TSG. And here's an example where I've done that to generate a downhole plot of feldspar species based on thermal infrared data. And so this is the validation data for this particular hole, and this is the model I generated from the thermal infrared data. You can also use this method to model other rock properties. So this is probably the most common and the spectral output that people are most comfortable with, because as geologists, saying this sample is 10% chlorite or 10% carbonate is intuitive for us. That being said, it's important to note that we're not calling it mineralogy, it's spectral mineralogy, because you'll never get from one spectral range the entire mineralogy of your sample. because the different spectral ranges are sensitive to different mineral species. So if you were to look at just the short-wave infrared from this hole, you would get an incomplete picture of what the entire mineralogy of that sample is. But if you're only looking for a specific mineral species to look at vectoring, it's not a huge deal. The second most common spectral output, and one that we kind of advocate for the use of, is the use of spectral indices or scalars or parameters. All kind of mean the same thing. Different people use different terms for it, but this is where you've taken your spectrum, which is that complicated long squiggly line, and derive single values from it based on specific parameters of interest. So this may be the depth and position of certain spectral features, band ratios, slopes, things like that. There's many ways to do this. You can look at single features. For instance, 2200 depth, which is something that many people are familiar with, which is related to the amount of white mica in your sample. And so 2200 feature is related to ALOH bonding, and that reflects your white mica. So the depth of that is proportional to relative to the amount of white mica. So you can see here's a plot of that. So white mica abundance on the y-axis. There are many ways to do this. You can do this yourself in NV or R or Python, basically extracting information about these features. Programs like TSG have some of these scalars automatically built in. And for a review of kind of recently published scalars, my colleague Karsten and a bunch of us put together an open access minerals paper that gives a good overview of what's out there. Similar scalars or parameters are also produced by service providers like AuScope. Here's an example of their wavelength chlorite scalar, which is basically looking at the position of the 2250 nanometer feature. And they've given this is just plotted up in IOGAS and shown some discrimination of which type of chlorite you have based on that. It's a similar method to, for instance, TSG, or what you could do in NV or Python or R if you wanted. Instrument providers such as CoreScan, Geolog, or TerraCore provide the similar outputs. So they might have slightly different names, but things like 2250 depth and wavelength are commonly used. And again, those are white mica and chlorite, and we're going beyond that today. But the one thing I have to say is, regardless of what method you choose, be consistent. Use the same method across all of your data sets, otherwise you won't be able to compare them. While they all use kind of similar methods and are quite close, if you want to do kind of some large scale data analysis, use a consistent method. Okay, so where are we at in terms of instrumentation? So we'll start on the biggest scale. So there's satellite hyperspectral systems have been around for ages. ASTER was launched in 1999. CSIRO's even developed continental scale ASTER maps based on those outputs. But in the last few years, there's been some really exciting advancements in this. So these older satellite things are multispectral satellites. And in the last kind of 2 years, we've seen the launching of several hyperspectral satellites. And so this is just showing the difference between multispectral, where across that wavelength range, you're maybe collecting data from 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 6 bands, which gives you a fairly kind of rough plot like that. But if you're looking at hyperspectral, you have a lot more bands that you're collecting data from, and so you can actually resolve more detail in your spectral features. So here's an example of the same data set shown from kind of this multispectral down to the hyperspectral stage. Airborne hyperspectral has also come a long way. There's many systems out there, but I just thought I'd highlight these UAV-based ones, because I think that's quite an exciting advancement, in that we can now put these hyperspectral systems, which range all the way from the VNIR to the SWIR, on UAV systems, and do kind of outcrop scale mapping that way. So those are relatively new. I think the UTABI, which is a mid-infrared imager, is actually is one of the most recently launched. There's also imaging systems that can be basically put on a tripod, allow you to image outcrops or pit faces. These are generally VNIR SWIR. There is a mid-infrared one available now as well. And so most of the work on these has been focused on looking at things like white mica and chlorite and clay content. The next scale up would be core scanning. And so there's several different technologies out there for doing continuous core scanning. HiLogger 3, which is developed by CSIRO and CoreScan, gives you VNIR SWIR thermal infrared, so that whole spectral range, as well as RGB imagery and laser profilometer. These are available at the State Geological Survey, CSIRO, and there's several commercial offerings as well. Data analysis for these is done using TSG, and you, again, like just about any other hyperspectral data set, the outputs are these spectral mineralogy logs and spectral indices. But it's unique in that it has both the thermal infrared and the VNIR SWIR, so you get that kind of more complete mineralogical picture of your sample. There's recently kind of a field portable version of this that does the shortwave infrared has been released by a group in Canada called Geological, called Hyperspectral Intelligence Instruments called Geological. And this allows you to do the same thing, core scanning, basically a measurement. You get a 1 centimeter swath down your drill core with a measurement every centimeter, which allows you to basically lay this over your core trays. And so it's field portable in that respect. And they do customized data analysis and outputs through the cloud platform. But again, I can't say how they do it because most of these commercial offerings are proprietary, but the spectral outputs are similar in that you get spectral mineralogy logs and indices. Now I gotta do a mandatory plug for the National Virtual Core Library because this is a big part of my work at CSIRO, but this is the world's largest online drill core mineralogy database. We have over 1.4 million meters of drill core across Australia. So if you are keen to look more into this, we've got data from across the entire country collected by the HiLogger system, which can be accessed for free online through several different online platforms. You can also search the entire data set for things if you want. So we've got portal analytics. And if you're interested in learning more about hyperspectral mineralogy and how to use these data sets, check out our webs page. We do workshops and training videos and such. And so this is all HiLogger data, HiLogger 3 data, so VNIR, SWIR, and thermal infrared, as well as RGB imagery. So kind of the next stage in core scale analysis has been the advent of core imaging systems. And these provide you with continuous spatially resolved mineralogy, which is pretty exciting, depending on what you're looking for, right? So you can get kind of micron to millimeter scale, spatially resolved mineralogy, which gives you textural information. And there's several different commercial offerings for this. CoreScan has their HCL3, which is a VNIR SWIR system. SpecIm has a Phoenix and Owl, which have kind of been uptaken by TerraCore, who I think uses the Owl, which is the long wave infrared. Geotech now has a SpecCam 4 system, which does VNIR SWIR. And what's been really exciting about this is most of these core hyperspectral imaging systems, they've been around for a long time, but they weren't developed for geoscience applications. You go to some of the company websites and they've got videos on how you can take a hyperspectral image of an orange to tell you if it's ripe or not. But their geoscience applications are relatively new in their development. And so companies like CoreScan and TerraCore are trying to take this well-established technology to the exploration industry. And I think that's really exciting. And that's really been facilitated by collaboration between researchers, industry, and service providers. And so you can now get these cool kind of core images where you can look at texturally your hyperspectral mineralogy. The challenge with these is it's a lot of data. You're getting a spectrum for every pixel. And so data reduction is an ongoing challenge, but you get really good sampling statistics because you have so many measurements. Probably the system that most folks are familiar with is handheld instrumentation. Things like TerraSpec. These are portable and easy to use. You can look at all sample types using these handheld instruments. So core, pulp, soils, reject, chips, cuttings, outcrop, whatever you happen to have on site. There's little to no sample prep. It's quick to collect large project-wide data sets. You can get over 500 measurements a day. And it scales really well with other handheld instrumentation. Like for instance, here's my colleague Neil with the PXRF and Monica with a handheld FTIR. And compared to some of the other techniques, they are low data volume and discontinuous data because you're not getting a continual line scan or image of your entire core tray. But if you do a systematic survey, it can be very successful, and particularly if you integrate it with for instance, a PXRF survey. So there's been some advancements in these portable techniques as well. The VNIR SWIR instruments have been around for a long time. They're getting to be industry standard, and things like the ASD, field spec or TerraSpec, or the spectral evolutions or expert or express are really well known, and these do the VNIR SWIR spectral range. The newest advancement in the VNIR SWIR has been the SR6500 by Spectral Evolution, and this is the highest spectral resolution spectral instrument on the market. And so it's like hyperspectral. You're able to resolve even finer features in your spectral data than you couldn't before. And I think probably for what I think is one of the more exciting developments in the handheld field is the development of handheld FTIR instrumentation. So this instrument here, which looks like a fancy PXRF space gun, is the Agilent 4300 DTGS. And this has a spectral range that catches kind of the tail end of the SWIR, the mid-infrared and the thermal infrared. And it can be used kind of as a point and shoot in the field. It weighs about 2 kilos. And so I think that's quite exciting. And I'll show you some examples as we go through on where these kind of thermal infrared applications can be done. And you'll notice that these are all VNIR SWIR. This is thermal, has a bit of mid-infrared, but I haven't really mentioned the mid-infrared otherwise. And that's because it's relatively new frontier. It's not very well characterized, but contains really important fundamental absorption bands. And that's largely because these instruments were not initially developed for geoscience applications. If someone had asked a geologist when they were building the first spectrometer, the SWIR range would not end at 2500. There's really important spectral features just beyond that, around 3000, 4000 nanometers. For instance, for carbonates and things like that, that would be really useful to have. And so CSIRO has been working as a part of the AuScope MVCL project to develop our understanding of the mid-infrared by creating a new spectral reference library, but also by helping the development of the HiLogger 4 system, which will be the world first VNIR SWIR mid-infrared, thermal infrared core line scanning system. So it's like a HiLogger 3, but that gap in the center of the spectral range is now filled. And it also has higher resolution core imagery and LiDAR. And so you can see how high resolution that profilometer is. You can resolve some basically marker pen on the core. So this will be coming out soon, hopefully. And it's kind of the newest cutting edge advancement in terms of core scanning technologies. And this will give you, like I mentioned, you'll never get the full picture of what's happening in your sample from one spectral range, but by combining the entire spectral range, you get closer to that understanding of kind of the bulk mineralogy of your sample. And so I've thrown a whole heap of technologies at you, but I think probably the most important thing to take home from this is that whatever instrument you select, that decision should be driven based on what the project is you're working on. What question are you asking? What mineral assemblage are you looking for? If you're looking for porphyry systems, for instance, then the short infrared is probably all you need because you can get basically the entire alteration assemblage of a porphyry system within that spectral range. If you're looking for something more complex like skarn systems, where you've got things like pyroxenes and garnets, and you might want to look in the thermal infrared. So you need to consider the wavelength range, the spectral resolution you're looking for, what kind of sample type you have, what data volume do you need? Do you really need, full core imagery with, 1,000 pixels for every little bit, or are you good having a measurement every centimeter or even every meter with a handheld instrument? And so those are the sorts of considerations in deciding how to move forward with the project, what to do that you should take. And so here's just a summary of how those variables change depending on whether you go from handheld to line scanning to imaging systems. The other thing to consider is what other data sets you're going to collect. So there's many integrated systems and workflows that are available now that allow you to collect hyperspectral data with other data sets. So Geotech has their MSCL4, which is a Spec M4, and their new instrument, the backscan. There's commercial offerings that will give you those data, Geochem and Hyperspectral together. At CSIRO, we're working on characterization workflows using different instrumentation projects like ultrafines, bringing those together for a specific sample medium, bringing things into kind of higher data processing packages like data mosaic. So there's lots that can be done. And so now we're gonna come to kind of the highlight reel bit of the talk, where I'm gonna show you some applications of hyperspectral mineralogy beyond white mica and chlorite. So the first is rare earth elements. So the VNIR is actually quite sensitive to rare earth elements. They have these really distinct spiky hyperspectral features. And so you can actually map rare earth elements using the visible near infrared if you don't have other really strong VNIR absorbers present. If you've got heaps of iron oxide, maybe not so much. So the example I'm going to show is mapping neodymium using these features at 740 and 800 nanometers. So this is an example from the Cummins range carbonatite complex and work that my colleagues Karsten and John Huntington did a few years back. This is kind of up here near the Kimberley. And what you have is high grade light rare earth element mineralization in dolomitic carbonatite dikes. And so what they were able to do is using a high logger data set, they were able to map neodymium apatite as well as carbonate using these data sets. And so here's your geological log, neodymium assay as to compare with. This is the neodymium proxy using that 744 nanometer feature. And you can see that the neodymium values estimated based on this hyperspectral parameter show all the regions of mineralization down this drill hole. And also by looking at a short infrared carbonate scalar, so looking at the depth of the 2320 feature, as well as the wavelength of that feature, which tells you something about the abundance and chemistry of the carbonate, you can see there's actually pretty significant compositional variability in the carbonates. And that while it was reported previously that mineralization occurred in these dolomitic carbonates, that actually through some of these sections, you have pretty significant mineralization, like right here in magnesium calcite and not actually dolomite. And so that has exploration implications and for understanding kind of orogenesis as well. And you can also map things like apatite using the thermal infrared. And so here's an example of showing how the apatite distribution relates to mineralization. The next example is looking at lithium exploration and kind of the regional scale and using hyperspectral data to level geochem. So this is a colleagues of mine, Alex, John Huntington, and Monica worked on this. What they did was they looked at regolith mineralogy from over 3,000 laterite pulp samples across southwestern WA. And in the SWIR, this is done using a high chips instrument, but basically the same measurement you get from an ASD. And they were able to create mineral maps of basically the subsurface mineralogy. And so looking at the distribution of gibbsite, kaolinite, and goethite, and create this regional subsurface mineralogy map. And you can see that the changes in this mineralogy correspond to kind of major tectonic or different geological provinces within WA. And then the application of this was they were looking at these old data sets to try and understand lithium potential across that area. And what they found is if you just plot, make a map, like a heat map of lithium, two of the biggest deposits in WA, Mount Holland and Greenbushes, actually don't stand out as anomalies. But if you level that lithium data using the mineralogy outputs that we have from the map, you get something that actually shows Mount Holland and Greenbushes not as just dark lows, but it does actually show up as anomalous lithium. The next example is looking at skarn mineralogy. And so I mentioned skarn systems as a system before where you may want to use the thermal infrared because you don't have a lot of SWIR active minerals. And so here's an example. This is not from Australia, but I think it's a really cool example from a paper that my colleague Karsten just put out, looking at the Antamina skarn-hosted copper zinc moly deposit. So what they developed were thermal infrared scalars. So these are the spectral parameters based on a specific feature for garnet, pyroxene, vesuvianite, quartz, and carbonate. And these were related to the abundance and composition of those mineral species. And they validated those scalars using ChemScan, EPMA, and QXRD data, and you did this both on core and coarse reject. And so what they're able to do is you can see here, these are the thermal infrared spectra from the core and the coarse reject. And these are some of the scalars related to these particular spectral features. So garnet composition index B and garnet composition index T, which are related to kind of the position of these, where those two lines are, and use that to distinguish garnet compositions, and validated that using the EMPI and XRD. What they found is garnets in this deposit cluster in certain different areas, where you've got these samples here, which are more andradite rich. These are potentially more uvarovite and more grossular in composition. And they were able to identify 5 different ore clusters with distinct garnet mineralogy. And from that, there's implications for things like exploration vectors based on garnet composition. So here's an example of that, where same thing, those composition indexes I showed you on the X and Y, so splitting up the garnets based on these spectral indices, and then colored by different elements. So this is plotted up showing copper, and so you can see the high copper samples all kind of sit up here. This is by zinc, the high zinc samples kind of sit here. And so using this information, they were able to, as well as a moly, able to kind of distinguish 5 different ore types with distinct garnet chemistries. So you've got your zinc copper plus or minus moly, high copper zinc with moly, etc. And so you've got these distinct compositions of garnet with different ore zones. And you can also look at that with respect to sulfide mineralization. And so this is the same plot, but colored up by pyrite. And you can see the samples that have the highest pyrite, say over 25% pyrite, all sit in this super high grade copper zinc zone. And the samples with the highest chalcopyrite sit in this really high grade copper zinc zone. What's really interesting is that while some of these other areas, like over here and down here, don't actually have all that much sulfide, so maybe less than even 5% in some cases, which means they might be quite difficult to identify as ore, but they still contain ore grade copper and zinc values that you can distinguish them as that ore type based on the garnet composition. And so I think that's quite a cool application. I wanted to show an Australian example. So this is an example from the Swan copper gold deposit on a project of just kind of finishing up, where we can use just the thermal infrared spectral outputs. So the other example showed you scalars, and this is showing you spectral mineralogy based on spectral unmixing to look at the scar mineralogy of this drill hole that goes right through the deposit. So you can see you've got kind of a hanging wall marble, footwall marble, and this is the breccia zone in the center. And you can look at things like apatite, which correlates really well with mineralization. Here's your copper assay. So apatite from the thermal infrared, epidote from the short infrared is really high in the ore zone. And then pyroxene from the thermal infrared increases as you come towards the main kind of scar and breccia body, and also correlates quite well with copper mineralization. And then you've got variability in your amphibole on the margins of the ore zone, and you plot that up. You can bring those outputs, these TR outputs, directly into its CSVs, and then bring into something like Leapfrog. And you can look at the distribution of these mineral phases with respect to the breccia body, which is in red, and then the ore zones. And you can see the change in increasing pyroxene content in this drill core towards mineralization. So next is an example from IOCG system zonation. And so IOCG system alteration mineralogy is quite complex and is dominated by iron oxides and also a lot of hydrated silicates like chlorite, biotite, white micas. That being said, in the short infrared, samples that are really high in hematite and magnetite are really difficult to interpret. The iron oxides really mess with the spectra. And so it can be quite tricky to do short infrared kind of vectoring in these systems, but there's also, feldspars like plagioclase albite that are important in terms of mineral system zonation. So I'm going to show an example from Olympic Dam, and later I'll come back to Ernest Henry. So this example from Olympic Dam is from some work that's done by our colleagues at GSSA, Alan Moje and Georgina Gordon, who looked at over 90 drill holes from across the deposit. And so they have this really beautiful pattern of drill holes through this world-class deposit. You can see them in side view. And they looked at the high logger data for all these. And so I'm going to show an example both using scalars and spectral mineralogy outputs. And so the first example is looking at the distribution of albite around the deposit and using the a scalar based on the depth of the feature at 9,800 nanometers, which was related to albite abundance. And what Alan was able to do is build a model that basically shows at 5-meter intervals, the decrease of albite away from the ore body. And so these are just shells showing from kind of lowest albite in the center of the ore body to higher albite on the margins. And what's interesting is this green kind of shell here aligns really well with the mapped biotite out shell, which BHP has put into place, which distinguishes an important kind of change in mineralogy more distal to the deposit. And so you're able to look at changes in this mineral species as you move away based on this feature. The next one is using TSA outputs. So these are spectral mineralogy outputs. And what Alan did was put together something he calls the DTO index, or the distance to ore index. And so we know that in this system, plagioclase, K-Feldspar, and quartz are all important in terms of mineral system zonation. And so just using the weights or the spectral mineralogy contributions from TSA, Alan was able to derive this index called DTO, which tells you essentially how far you're moving away from the ore body. And he's modeled that here, showing these shells. So if you're in an area where you didn't have that much drilling, but you had this DTO index, you could start getting an idea of where you are in respect to your ore body. The other example I'll show is around carbonate discrimination. Many folks may be familiar with the short infrared carbonate discrimination, which is related to the position of this 2320 feature, which I referred to earlier as well in that rare earth example. But really the thermal infrared is amazing for carbonate discrimination. And so you've got two major features at around 1100 and 1400, and also here at 6500, which are quite diagnostic. And by using these features, as shown by our colleagues, Dave Green, who's at the Geological Survey Tasmania, they're able to really well distinguish these different carbonate species. And then you can use this discrimination to map carbonates in ore systems where carbonate speciation is important. For instance, this is an example from the Rosebery VHMS deposit, where they're able to look at carbonate speciation downhole, basically, and abundance, and identify the ore zone as iron rhodochrosite and cutnahorite and siderite rich, with respect to the more distal regions, which are more calcite, anchorite, dolomite rich. The same concept can be applied to correlating stratigraphy. This is my favorite drill hole example, which has a beautiful chlorite and white mica case study. We're not talking about that today, so I thought I was going to show the drill holes anyways, where you can use the carbonate from the spectral mineralogy output, TSA, to correlate stratigraphy between two drill holes that are 5K apart. And actually, based on the logging, quite difficult to correlate because one was logged by a lumper and the other was logged by a splitter. But if you look at the TSA outputs downhole, they line up just beautifully. You can map these two carbonate layers down here, but also this chlorite-rich unit at the top, which has these kind of feldspar-rich sections of sediment, which I found quite useful because for me as a non-sedimentologist, this all kind of looked like blackish gray stuff to me. And so having this insight into the downhole mineralogy is really useful. You can also use carbonate abundance from the thermal infrared to map volcanic flows. So you can map flow tops, which are calcite altered, using this. And here's an example from just below this stratigraphy, where if you, the light blue is higher carbonate abundance, you can actually map the tops of individual volcanic flow tops and look at units which are more massive flows, like in here where you don't have any alteration. And so can assist with correlating stratigraphy, but also assisting with geological logging in a more practical sense. And so here's an example from the Obelisk copper gold deposit in WA, where you've got some complex geology of amphibolite with some pegmatite and overlying metasamite. And these sorts of geological logs are amazing. They're detailed, they take a lot of time to do. But what if you could take something simple and easy to collect in the field like hyperspectral mineralogy and generate something equivalent, automated in an objective way without having someone pour over the core first? Well, you can. So you can use hyperspectral mineral outputs in a software package like the CSIRO developed Data Mosaic, where you import, this is an example showing just the TSA outputs. You import them in, it does a sample classification based on clustering methods, and then automatically picks your domains downhole based on the downhole signal from this hyperspectral mineralogy using a technique called wavelet tessellation. And then you pick, so it gives you this multi-scale downhole plot where each of these lines across is a domain, a change, a boundary between rock types, or basically a boundary between that designates the change in the downhole signal you've put in this case, the spectral mineralogy. And then you can select whatever scale you want to look at and export that as a log, which you can see correlates really well to both the mineralogy log and the alteration log. And not only that, it outputs it as a CSV file, similar to what you'd be familiar with doing in logging. And so you can use it for that. You can also use hyperspectral scalars to do the same thing. And so this is an example using 4 scalars, which are commonly used from the SWIR, whereas the other one combined the thermal infrared and the SWIR. So these are related to white mica chlorite and amphibole content. And same thing, do a classification based on clustering to get your different kind of rock units. And then you distinguish the boundaries between them using wavelet tessellation through the Data Mosaic app. Select your scale, which is relevant. Say this is the scale you want to look at, which is close to your alteration log, and export a CSV directly. And so this is a process that takes a matter of minutes and can be used to then go and use this output to look at your drill core as kind of an assisted objective way to look at boundaries in your drill core data. And it preserves the smaller scale information as well, even if you pick a large scale like this. So the last application I'm going to talk about is predicting rock properties. So because hyperspectral mineralogy is quite fast, inexpensive, you can use it to classify domains and predict more costly or time-consuming rock properties or lab results, things like geochem, petrophysics, rock type alteration. This can be done relatively simply if you have the scaling and spatial resolution between your data sets the same. And so there's this is something that's getting increasingly picked up by different groups in industry. In CSIRO, we have the Rosetta framework, which allows us to work with large data sets using different types of algorithms. But the added bonus with this is we are able to produce uncertainty estimates on our predictions. And we've done this using shortwave infrared data to predict, for instance, copper grade or different geochemical parameters. We do a lot of bespoke projects. So I'm going to show an example of some of these where we've use hyperspectral data to predict geochemistry, mineralogy, petrophysics. There's also several different commercial offerings. BV, ALS, SGS have, as you can imagine, they're collecting data sets every day. And so they've got huge training data sets and are able to predict many different rock properties based on those. So this is the example I showed at the very beginning where I was able to use thermal infrared data calibrated by TIMA results, which is the SEM-based mineralogy, to create a downhole plot of feldspar speciation, which basically shows the zonation and feldspars moving towards ore in a drill core from the Ernest Henry copper gold deposit. And so you can do that relatively quickly. This is done in TSG actually. Another example, this is from Karsten's paper on the Antamina skarns, where in addition to generating these different garnet compositions related to different ore types, you're able to predict the abundance of total garnet, but as well as different garnet species like andradite using a PLS model. So you got your predicted versus the truth, which is in this case, XRD or ChemScan. You can do the same thing but for predicting geochemistry. So this is an example where my colleagues used the same PLS method to predict spodumene content and lithium assays based on measurements from a handheld thermal infrared instrument. And this is because the thermal infrared is really sensitive to spodumene, which is a pyroxene mineral. And so you can build a model to predict both spodumene, and in these particular deposits, most of the lithium is hosted in spodumene. So you can really effectively predict lithium just based on a handheld thermal infrared method, which, as most of you would know, lithium is increasingly difficult to get from handheld methods because XRF is not sensitive to it. You can also use hyperspectral methods to predict things like petrophysical parameters. So because your hyperspectral data is physiochemically kind of tied to your sample, any kind of parameter that's related to that could be pretty much predicted. So this is an example where Karsten used short-wave infrared to predict petrophysical parameters like density and mag-sus using both VNIR square and thermal infrared data. So these are the predicted mag-sus values and the actual measured lab mag-sus values. And this is done straight from the hyperspectral data. So I know this has been a lot, but in summary, I hope that what I've shown is that hyperspectral data sets can provide critical insights into exploration from the regional to the mine scale, non-destructively and in real time. There's so many applications beyond white mica and chlorite, although I'm not gonna lie, that is the first thing I check when I get a new hyperspectral data set because it works quite well. And this presentation has only really scratched the surface. There's applications looking at epidote speciation, sulfates, weird sulfates like copper and nickel sulfates, transported cover, non-sulfide zinc minerals, the list goes on. And that's largely because advances in the thermal infrared and mid-infrared sensing technologies provide new opportunities to look at really complex mineral assemblages that we couldn't really look at before because they're just full of swirl non-active minerals. I think that the most significant advances are being made in the data processing side of things, the integration with other data sets to output process-specific spectral parameters. So things like distance to ore or even kind of geometallurgical parameters, things like that. But really the key thing for taking these hyperspectral data sets and developing new and meaningful applications for exploration is this ongoing fundamental research and kind of generating and maintaining a collaboration between industry, service providers like TerraCore, CoreScan, et cetera, and researchers trying to harness the best value out of these data sets. So with that, thank you for having me, and I'm happy to take any questions. I've got a list of references here if folks are keen. I'll just put that up in that way. It'll be in the video.